Okay, so very, very warm welcome to you all. Sorry, just admitting one other person. So if I can start by introducing myself and my colleague who is on the call as well and who will be helping behind the scenes with this session. I'm one of the two mentor leads at Cardiff Met in the Cardiff Partnership. My name is Emma Oduha, formerly Emma Thayer, hence the reason why my email address is slightly different. I recently got married. I'm joined in the background by my colleague Kerry Bevan, who is another of the mentor leads here in the Cardiff Partnership, and also on the call, who works really hard to make these things happen and will be a really good point of contact throughout your time as a mentor on our programmes, is Rachel Newby from the Cardiff Partnership team. And you can reach the general Cardiff Partnership admin team on that email address that you've got on the screen there, ite@cardiffmet.ac.uk. It's a good one to write down should you encounter any technical issues with PRP, or if you've got any sort of general questions relating to Cardiff Partnership admin, then that's always a good one to write down. Okay, so that's us. Just to give you a bit of insight, I'm admitting people as I go. So I've got a little bit of cognitive overload here, delivering and admitting people, and I'm also keeping an eye on the chat. So bear with me as we go through. I can see that we've got a comment in here from somebody who's saying that someone can't access the link and unable to get through. Really sorry, not really able to sort of support that right at this moment in time. I advise them to sort of continue accessing the link, perhaps signing in, making sure they're signed into Teams. But I am going to get going. Hopefully they'll be able to sort out their technical issues and find their way to us. All right, so let's get going. What are we going to cover in this session? Well, first thing I'm going to do is just to give you some quick reminders. We've changed and made a couple of tweaks and changes to our programmes this year that those of you who've been long-standing mentors with us or who've mentored in the past for us will need to know. The bulk of the session, however, will be to provide research-informed ideas to support your own practice as mentors that help us meet and really sort of dovetail with our mentor lead priorities this year. And we come to these priorities by thinking about the feedback that we've had from Estin, the feedback that we've had from the Education Workforce Council. And so those priorities are really helping us to sort of drive forward key aspects for development in the partnership. So that's the plan. And we will finish promptly at 5 o'clock because you've all got homes and families to get to. If you're just joining us, just be sure to mute yourself and switch off your camera because we are recording, and we will carry on. So quick reminders. We have got a whole suite of professional learning for this spring term. Here we are on Wednesday the 17th, delivering this to all mentors. You've got some other sessions coming up down the line. If you are a BA primary mentor who is going to be working with Clinical Practice 1, Placement 1 student teacher, you've got a bespoke session that's taking place on Monday the 22nd of January for an hour. So anything that's really specific to BA primary, Placement 1 will be covered in that session. It will of course be recorded, but try best to go along to that. If you're a PGCE secondary or PGCE primary mentor, you've got some sessions coming up that are aimed at learning and teaching observations and progress reviews, and they are top tips sessions to help you when it coincides with the first one that you have to do, the first learning and teaching observation form, and when the first progress review form is due to come in. So hopefully they'll help you. They're quite short sessions, 30 minutes and 45 minutes if you want a refresher and a bit of support in preparation for doing that. Okay. Some more quick reminders. If you're not convinced already, if you're a mentor in the past and you didn't use the clinical practice guide in the past, please make sure that you've got it handy. We will send it out after the session. It is also available on the Cardiff Partnership for Initial Teacher Education area on Microsoft Teams. But many of our mentors and senior mentors refer to the clinical practice guide as the Bible because it does guide you through week by week. You, student teachers, senior mentors, it guides you through what is required of you on a week by week basis. And it's also got a lot of handy appendices in the back that will help to guide you in your role as mentor. And I'll be flagging up some of those in this session. You will have been asked, if you're a PGCE, or certainly senior mentors will have been asked, to provide details to get you linked up to your student teacher's professional learning portfolio, the PLP. So if you could make sure that you provide anything that the senior mentor asks for in a timely manner in relation to the PLP. All of our assessment forms are completed by mentors on the student teacher's PLP. So if you don't have access to that, it can cause real problems down the line in trying to get those assessment forms done in a timely manner. So do make sure that you provide any information that's requested from the university via your senior mentor, and hopefully we'll get you hooked up really, really quickly. Remember that your senior mentor is an important first port of call. And they work really closely with a university tutor. Every school in our partnership has got a Link University tutor that gets to know the school really well, that gets to know the senior mentor really well. So if any teething problems arise when you welcome your new student to you, if you've got any problems accessing their PLP, etc., direct those to your senior mentor, and if they can't answer them, then they will turn to us and we will support. This is just one final reminder, because I can see that we've got two colleagues on the call that haven't switched off their cameras. We are recording. You will be visible on the recording, so if you're able to, do switch off your cameras. Thank you. Something that we also send out on a weekly basis is a weekly senior mentor and mentor briefing. We've had time and time again had feedback from schools to say that they're really handy. They include a lot of useful information that, for things that are going on that week on clinical practice. So be sure to have a look at those. They're going to really help guide you as you go through. And then finally, as I mentioned earlier on, we've got the Cardiff Partnership admin team who are there to support. And we've also got a clinical practice mentors YouTube channel, and I'll flag up some of the resources that are available on there a bit later on. But please note that a recording of this session will be available on there after the fact. So if you want to catch up on anything that you missed, if you have to leave early, then you'll be able to catch up on the recording. Okay. Couple of other quick reminders, and I'm going to flag up some key changes for this academic year. We've got some changes to the course structure, particularly affecting PGCE. So if I start with them first, you can see that very busy looking table on the left of those two tables is the PGCE secondary and primary programme structure for this year. And for those of you who've been mentors in the past, you'll know that in previous years, student teachers attended school-led training days on Thursdays and they were at university on Fridays. Based on feedback that we've had from senior mentors, from students, we've changed that day to a Wednesday, and we haven't managed to magic up a second day of the week. The reason why we've got two columns for Wednesday is because on the days that secondary student teachers are on school-led training days, the primary student teachers are with us at university, and then we alternate week to week. But what that should mean for you as mentors is that your students will be with you consistently Monday, Tuesday, Thursday, Friday for most of their second clinical practice, and that will hopefully make it easier for you to timetable their teaching, to put together their learning timetable. If you've just joined us a little bit late, can I politely ask that you switch off your mic and switch off your camera? Thank you very much. Okay, so the other thing that we've put into the programme schedule this year that affects clinical practice too, and again based on feedback from colleagues for PGCE, is that immediately after Easter we're giving student teachers 3 full weeks of 5 days a week on clinical practice with you, and that is based on feedback from mentors and senior mentors and students, which is that in order to help them transition to their newly qualified teaching year and that heavier teaching load, they wanted to see what it felt like to be in being in school for 5 days a week with a slightly more increased independent teaching load. So we've factored that in for the PGCE programme. You'll notice that on the BA, if you've got a BA year 2 student coming to you for their first placement, their placement starts with you a little bit later than the PGCE. They're going to be coming to you week beginning the 5th of February. And they've got 5 full days with you, but then they get into their regular pattern of 4 days, Monday to Thursday, and then their SLT day on a Friday. So again, that should be a nice stable timetable for you to put together that works within those constraints. Couple of other things that are new this year: quality assurance and quality enhancement paperwork that isn't completed by mentors, it's completed by senior mentors and us. That's all going on to the PLP, so it's just to flag that up to you. And lastly, and this is important for you to know, particularly if you're a PGCE secondary or primary mentor, is that concern over progress paperwork is completed on the PLP. Now, in years gone by, concern over progress paperwork has been completed on various different paperwork that has been sort of emailed around the relevant colleagues. Now we've got it all in one place. It's going to be on the PLP under the assessment tab. So if you've got a student coming to you who was on Consider for Progress for Clinical Practice 1, then you'll be able to see what happened. You'll be able to see what the conclusion was of that, and you'll be able to work with the student, with that sort of journey in mind. And if anything arises in CP2, or if you're a BA and anything arises in CP1, all of that paperwork will be there on the PLP. So it's all transparent and everybody can see it. Okay, so those are the quick reminders. So that's that part of the session done. Now we're going to get into the nitty-gritty of the session, and we're going to look at our mentor lead priorities for this year. There are 4 of them, and we've planned this session so that the content meets those priorities or works towards addressing those priorities. So the first one is about assessing student teachers on clinical practice. We know from feedback that we need to do more to develop senior mentor and mentors' confidence and competence when using the STEEL descriptors. So that's the unaware, aware, capable, QTS plus, to make judgments, assessment judgments, and to support a dialogic approach to the progress review. And that's that sort of key assessment point at a midpoint and at the end point of the clinical practice, where you sit down with the student, you think about their more holistic progress towards the 32 elements of the professional standards, and you have a professional dialogue with them about how they're progressing. So we're going to do a bit of work in this session about how we can increase our confidence and competence when using those STEEL descriptors. Another priority for us, and this came directly from ESTIM, from our recent ESTIM report, is a focus on lesson planning. So we tried to put together some materials to support you as mentors and also your senior mentors in developing the student teachers' quality of their lesson planning and evaluations. So we'll have a little bit of input on that. Our third priority is relating to our clinical practice model for initial teacher education that we've got here at Cardiff Met. And what that does is it places a lot of emphasis on student teachers being able to integrate and interrogate different types of knowledge that they get from you as expert teachers, knowledge that they get from theory, knowledge from the learners, and that they bring all of that together in order to take measured risks in developing their practice. So we're going to introduce you to a new model for encouraging them to do that. And it's one that you might start to use with your students after you've observed their lesson, maybe when you're encouraging them to engage in critical reflection after it. So this will hopefully be quite new to all of you, and might help to move your practice forward when encouraging your students to reflect. And then finally, our last priority is about beginning teachers as learners. We've had a lot of work going on in the partnership, and particularly at university, we've had some professional learning from colleagues at the University of Oxford, who have written a really accessible book on beginning teachers learning. So we're going to be drawing from that and coming up with or sharing with you some techniques that you can use to support your student teachers as learners and to better understand their behaviour as learners and their preferences as learners too. So those are our priorities. And how do they chime with your role and the key tenets of your role? Well, we think that the first thing that those priorities chime with is that you've got a responsibility to induct your student teacher into the school environment. And by putting together for them a learning timetable and scaffolding that learning experience. So our priority about beginning teachers as learners and knowing how to work with them as learners, it kind of really chimes with that aspect of your role. You're also expected to provide dedicated time each week to meet with your student teachers to discuss subject or phase specific professional learning and progress. So the clinical reasoning techniques that we introduce in this session will hopefully help give you some more tools in your arsenal on that front. You're obviously also expected to collaborate with the student teachers to develop their planning, their teaching, their evaluating, and that focus on lesson planning speaks to that aspect of your role. And finally, the priority that we've got around assessment speaks to the bit in your role, which is all about assessing their progress, your student teachers' progress, both formally and in those really important formative discussions that you have when you're giving them feedback throughout the placement. So there you have it. That's what we're going to focus on. That's why it's important to you in your role. So let's look at the first one. The first priority is all about assessment. So because you're an existing mentor, it might be actually that you've come to new mentor training and now you're coming to all mentor training. So it might be that you haven't assessed student teachers on our programs before. Some of you might have. So what do we need to think about before we can start to think about improving our practice in this area? Well, the first thing we need to do is remind ourselves of those 4 stages that student teachers progress through and that we use to assess our student teachers on the course. The first one is the unaware stage. And here we're drawing from the work of Carol Steele, whose research identified that teachers do tend to sort of progress through these stages. And when they're in the unaware stage, it can sound quite cruel. We're not saying that they are, completely not able to do anything in the classroom. But what we're saying here is that they're relatively unaware of important information related to pedagogy and human development. An example of this is that there might be certain concepts or practices in teaching that they've never heard of before, such as differentiation. It is possible that student teachers on the BA and the PGC can come to us having no knowledge of that. So they're relatively unaware of how that might inform their pedagogy. But as new facts are learned and new skills are attempted, their understanding increases. Then we go to the aware stage. And this is where they begin to master the concepts, theories, and context specific information related to their pedagogies that they're attempting. And I suppose this is an important distinction between unaware and aware. It's that when they become aware, they have a better understanding of why they're doing what they're doing in the classroom. They might not be particularly successful, and they certainly won't necessarily be independent and confident in their application of those pedagogical approaches or the application of concepts, but they've got a better understanding of why they're doing it, why it's necessary. At the aware stage, their ideas and techniques are put into action, but first attempts, and you might be able to sort of relate to this yourself, may be heavily scaffolded by someone else, by you, the mentor. You might be that you're having to give them a lot of support and scaffolding, or they may not just turn out as they expected because they haven't had that, they haven't got that level of independence and confidence. When they get to capable, important to remind you all that this is the point at which you're recommending student teachers for qualified teacher status. In order to gain qualified teacher status, they need to show that they are capable in all 32 elements of the professional standards for teaching and leadership. So here we're saying that they are mainly confident, they are mainly independent, and although they might still need to concentrate intently on planning for or applying a particular teaching technique or skill, the student teacher will be increasingly comfortable and they will have that growing repertoire of skills to draw upon. So if something does go wrong when they're on their own in the classroom, they've got that broader repertoire and that broader experience to help them help themselves in that moment. And then finally, we have got the QTS Plus stage, which is aligned with the induction descriptors for NQTs. And this is where we'll see that the student teacher's practice is firmly embedded and very consistent as well. Okay, so we want them to be aspirational. So it's important to remind ourselves of these things before we get into how we can be more confident in our assessment judgments. Remember that we've got some really handy adjectives that help us to sort of describe, reflect upon, encourage the student teachers to reflect upon their developing practice. So when we're unaware, we're looking at a student teacher who's got limited knowledge or limited understanding, limited in their skills, maybe lacking rigor, might be over-reliant on the mentor. So we've got some really useful descriptions there that a student can use to reflect and that you can use to help you guide your assessment judgments. When they move to aware, we're talking about inconsistency and with support. And then in comparison, we've got somebody who is capable, who is mainly consistent, who is mainly independent. So hopefully this table, which is in the back of the clinical practice guide, will be really useful as well. So it's important to just have those up front. So how can we develop our confidence and competence when using the STEEL descriptors to make assessment judgments? Well, before we get into that, and I am going to be asking for some ideas from you on this front, we need to understand the way that student teachers learn through the elements of the standards, because although, as you can see on the screen there, we have actually got individual elements of the standards, they're quite granular. We have got 32 of them in total, 17 for pedagogy, we've got 4 in collaboration, and they need to be at capable in all of them. The way that student teachers learn is in a much more integrated way. They learn through the standards. An example of that, just by looking at what we've got in front of us on the screen here, is that we can't really think about assessment in isolation, because when we assess the learners, we are also able to differentiate better because we've got a better understanding of how they're progressing. If we're managing the learning environment well, then we might be able to implement assessment more effectively. So in the pedagogy standard, we see that the standards integrate, but also if we think about collaboration, professional learning, they can often be used as the vehicle for helping a student teachers to move their practice forward. So if they're having difficulty understanding differentiation approaches, then they might need to do some professional learning around it. They might need to do some reading. They might need to collaborate with another member of staff. That might be you. They might need to go back to doing some observations. So although you need to, as mentors, assess whether or not they've hit all of those at capable by the end of the year, in reality, you should be encouraging the student teacher to improve, not prove, and to adopt that attitude, not about, how many of these do I need to hit that particular target, encouraging them to think much more reflectively and thinking about how can I improve, how can I become more independent, more robust, more thorough in my understanding of these particular standards. So we encourage you to use aware, capable, QTS plus unaware and the adjectives associated with them to identify in your student teachers the behaviours and the dispositions of your student teacher. What sort of behaviours are indicative of aware, of capable, and that might help make the difference. An example of that is you might have a student teacher that's really reliant on you as the mentor, and until they realise that they're too dependent on you, they're not necessarily going to tip over from aware to capable. So it's really important that they use those STEEL descriptors to help reflect. And what we know from the work, some of the research we've been doing in the Cardiff Partnership, is that by encouraging student teachers to reflect through professional dialogue, by speaking to them and encouraging them to reflect on their progress, you can begin to see and understand better their behaviours and dispositions for learning and whether they are indeed indicative of aware, unaware, capable or QTS plus. Now, before I stop talking, I give you the opportunity to watch a little video of a student teacher talking to their mentor. I just want to draw your attention to this source. It's a little bit dated now, but I think this quote still really resonates. And what Haggerburn and McIntyre are talking about here, and they're talking directly to mentors, because this comes from a book that's about, it's a mentor handbook that they've written. It's about the use of professional dialogue. And they say to gain as much as possible from their time in school, student teachers need to be made aware of the ideas they hold about teaching. They will come to you having experienced teaching from a learner perspective. So they will have ideas about teaching, what makes good teaching, what makes bad teaching, and they need to be given the opportunity by you to discuss and critically evaluate them. And by helping student teachers to learn to teach, you therefore need to encourage them to articulate their ideas, to get them out in the open, both in general terms and in relation to specific lessons that they've taught. And when they do that, you can then get them and help them to begin to question those ideas. So if they come into you thinking that, I'm never going to do group work with my learners because I had a really bad experience of group work as a learner, and they might have really strong ideas about group work. Unless you get those ideas to the fore and encourage them to question them, then they won't necessarily have a full understanding and change their perspective on those sort of preconceptions about teaching and learning that they came to you with. So you can seek to establish through discussion, as well as observation and practice, whether those ideas that they hold are helpful to their teaching or whether they're actually valid. So that's why professional dialogue is really important. And we encourage you to use that a lot in your mentoring practice. Okay, so what's going to happen now is I'm going to share a link, a YouTube link to a just under 5-minute video, and it's available on YouTube. And in this video, you're going to be hearing a student teacher who is on her first clinical practice. She's a PGC secondary English teacher. It doesn't really matter that she's secondary, it will still be applicable to primary. But she's talking to her mentor about how she made progress in one of the pedagogy elements. She's talking about progression in learning, P11. And she's specifically reflecting on, with the mentor, how she moved from unaware to aware in this particular element of the standards. So what we'd like you to do, please, is to watch this video. And we're going to give you about 10 minutes to both watch the video and do a little bit of reflection. And I'll give you a bit of a comfort break as well. What does professional dialogue, what does this conversation between the mentor and the student reveal about the student teacher's learning as they progress from unaware to aware? What does it make clear about the things that made the difference to her learning as she progressed from unaware to aware? So I'm just going to post this link now in the chat. Helpfully, I make it just coming up to 4 o'clock. So we're going to reconvene at 10 past. So that will give you 5 minutes to watch the video and then 5 minutes to jot down some thoughts, because I'm going to ask you to provide some feedback in the chat on that question. So I'm going to mute myself now, switch off my camera. It's over to you to watch the video and to jot down some thoughts with regard to the question on the slide. Diolch. Okay, everyone, if I could ask you to just start finding your way back into the virtual space, and to also consider that question that you've got on the screen in relation to what you just watched. We've got some really great comments that have already come through in the chat, just generally about considering your student teachers teaching timetable as a learning timetable for them. And I'm presuming that both colleagues are secondary colleagues, and I understand that this video is slightly limited in some ways because it is a secondary example. But likewise, with primary pupils, if they've got opportunities to work with a range of not necessarily classes, but AOLEs, giving them lots of different opportunities to sort of apply the feedback that you've given them quite quickly after you've given it, so they can see the impact of that feedback straight away. So thank you for those contributions that come through in the chat already. So coming back to this conversation between Lucy and Grace, her mentor, I'd like you, if you will, to pop some ideas in the chat. What did that discussion reveal about how Lucy's learning, how Lucy's how she progressed, from unaware to aware in this particular standard, and what made the difference to that learning? I'm just going to pause for you to pop some of those thoughts in the chat, or if anybody wants to contribute by unmuting themselves, feel free to use the raise hand or just unmute at will. Okay, so lovely. We've already got a contribution. This is the moment where you've got to lean into the silence after you've posed a question, particularly when teaching online. So we've got a nice comment here about rotating activities with differentiated focused tasks, hopefully helping students to gain awareness of progression. That's interesting. So a particular strategy there that is there to sort of help the student teacher, presumably in that early stage of getting an understanding of differentiation. And at that unaware stage, that could be something as a strategy that's really helpful in thinking about the link with progression. Something that might stimulate some thoughts here, if we just come to some of these thoughts on the screen, and obviously feel free to pop some thoughts in the chat if you haven't had a chance to already, is that hopefully you could see that that professional dialogue revealed how Lucy learned and progressed. It sort of made what was going on in her head, made the implicit explicit. She was able to describe how she had sort of very little understanding of how progression happens at the beginning. And in some ways it was limited by the time that she had spent with the learners. And so by talking to her about that, it sort of revealed what was indicative of unaware at that particular stage. It also identified some of the approaches that her mentor was using that were actually hindering her from making progress from unaware to aware. And she mentioned specifically team teaching. So when she was team teaching with her mentor, she was only responsible for delivering a small portion of the lesson. And so what she didn't gain a full understanding of was how progression was happening over a whole lesson. So it's really useful to engage your student teachers in this sort of dialogue, because it can be quite revealing to you as the mentor about what is working and what is not necessarily helping the student teacher. And she also flagged up things that really were helping her to progress. She talked about things that she was doing, but also what the mentor was doing. She was talking about planning a sequence of lessons over time and evaluating that over time. And by going through that process, getting a better understanding about how she was influencing progress over time. Oh, and I can see a comment that's come through exactly in that vein. So we've got C Wild here. Sorry, we can't always see first names. So planning a series of consecutive lessons allows the student teacher to monitor progression, to reflect and adapt as the pupils are learning. And those sort of skills, those teacher skills, is a really great point about monitoring progression, about reflecting on progression, about then adapting her practice or their practice. They're things that won't necessarily come naturally to the student teacher. So by making sure that they've got the opportunity to plan that series of consecutive lessons, by encouraging them after that to reflect on it, having a professional dialogue about it, should help you to determine whether they can see that that's helped their learning or not, and check their level of understanding. So thank you for that contribution. So it really does make their learning visible and could allow then you as the mentor to plan interventions or approaches to aid further progress. It also emphasises, if you listen to the dialogue, how Lucy learns through the standards. So by asking the right questions, the mentor sort of encouraged her to consider how other aspects of pedagogy had helped her understand and progress in P11, and also how collaboration had helped her to learn and how she considers them when she's talking about them in an integrated way. And it emphasises the significance of collaboration. I think this is important for you to all remember early on, whether you're getting a CP2 student or a CP1 student, is that that early collaboration between you and the student is going to be a real vehicle for their learning in the first instance. Many of them talk about the power of collaboration in helping them progress. So thanks for the contributions that we have had. The other thing I want to draw your attention to is that this conversation happened in the context of a progress review meeting. So this was at the midpoint of Lucy's first clinical practice placement, when she was reflecting on all of the standards. Obviously, this is her talking to her mentor about one strand in particular, but what we have found through looking at these videos and quality assuring the progress reviews and those sorts of discussions is that it's the quality of the questions that the mentor is asking that is really helping the student teacher to do what C Wild's talking about there, to reflect and to monitor their progress. So we thought we'd share with you the sorts of questions that we implore you to be asking the student when you're having that progress review meeting, and even more important, that you make sure you do sit down at those key assessment points and have that conversation. So Grace, the mentor, was asking, what did your practice look like before and after you made progress? She was encouraging her to give examples or artifacts of practice to illustrate this. And that might be encouraging them to reflect on the pupil's work that indicated that what they did had impact. It might be, as colleagues have mentioned in the chat, sort of looking at their reflections on the pupil's progress and how that's indicative that they've moved from unaware to aware. She was asked, what steps did I make to support your progress? And it can be a little bit scary to sort of ask the student teacher, you know, what am I doing that's helping? Am I doing anything that's hindering? Is anything that you need more of, less of? But really important to ask that question. What steps did you take as a student teacher to support your progress? Really important that we're encouraging them to reflect on the things that are working and things that they need to do more of. What research and inquiry activities supported your progress? All of you will now know that we've got a big emphasis on our programmes on research and inquiry and making sure that the student teachers are encouraged to use that time wisely. And then finally, how did other areas of the standards support progress in this element? So therefore encouraging them to think about using the standards to help them learn and progress. So it might be that she goes off and does a bit more professional learning about progression and understanding how that works over time. So really important that you don't skip that progress review meeting, that you encourage your student teachers to reflect regularly on how they're progressing, and even better if they look at the language of an aware, capable QTS plus to really start to think, okay, so am I being mostly independent? Am I being mostly confident? And how do I know that? Where is the evidence of that in my practice over time? And then the last bit on this point is to say that that video was part of a much bigger resource called the YouTube Shared Understanding Project. It's all available on YouTube. And we've got a number of elements of the standards in there for which we have both Welsh and English medium videos from a range of contexts, not just secondary, we've got primary and secondary, where student teachers are talking to their mentors and sometimes talking to their senior mentors about how they've progressed from unaware to aware, aware to capable, capable to QTS plus in those elements of the standards. So worth having a look at those, dipping into them to help you with your confidence and competence in assessing student teachers against the standards. Okay. So moving on to our second priority now and starting to think about lesson planning. And this one's going to be quite quick. I'm just going to be flagging up to you some extra resources that we've provided within the clinical practice guide to help you support student teachers with the quality of their lesson plans and evaluations. And we can see that, you know, some of the comments coming through in the chat is about encouraging them to reflect, encouraging them to plan a sequence of lessons and to evaluate. So we've got to make sure that they're doing that well and digging into what happened via the evaluations as best we can. So some of the issues that have arisen amongst the plans that we've dipped into through our quality assurance visits over the last few years is that student teachers are particularly finding it challenging to move beyond thinking of lessons as a string of activities and instead to formulate clear, measurable learning intentions with specific success criteria. And with the activities that they are planning and assessment methods and differentiation strategies being really driven by those intentions and sort of everything joining up together. So those are the issues that we've been finding. So the interventions that we've made is that we've got this sort of mandatory spiral curriculum input from university and senior mentors. So now they learn about lesson planning and evaluating from a university perspective, whether they're BA or PGCE, but also the senior mentor at key points in the year returns to lesson planning and evaluating so that they're constantly encouraged to return to it and to reflect on it. And then the thing that's going to be most important to you as mentors is we've got a new appendix in the clinical practice guide entitled Guidance for Mentors Supporting Student Teachers in Planning. So in there, you'll find a number of approaches, strategies for use during the observation period. So when they first come to you, there are strategies that you can use to get them thinking about how you've planned the lessons that that the students observe. Now, of course, we don't expect for you to be sort of formally planning all of your lessons, but certainly after the student teacher has observed it, it's really useful for them to sort of reverse engineer it, or for you to make clear to them what your sort of key intentions were and why you did what you did and why you planned it that way. We've got a real emphasis now. It used to be that we'd call the early stages of a student teacher's practice team teaching. We've rebranded this now as team planning and teaching, because we know that if you are going to team plan as a mentor, team teach as a mentor with a student teacher, a step that can sometimes get missed, mainly because we're time poor, is to sit down with the student first and plan that lesson together. So you're both on the same page so that you can articulate your sort of tacit knowledge about why you're planning it in a certain way. And so that if, like Lucy, you are making your student teacher responsible for teaching a small part of the lesson, they still have an understanding of how their part of the lesson delivery fits into that bigger plan, that bigger picture of the lesson in its entirety. So we got some ideas in that appendix for that. Ideas about how you can focus your formative comments in the Blue Book on the lessons that you observe student teachers teach on their plans, and how you can have more structured mentor feedback conversations that really kind of bring the student teacher back to the plan versus reality. How did what happened in the lesson, how did it link to what they'd hoped would happen as came through in the plan? So I'm just going to pause there because I can see that we've got another comment that's come through in the chat, and I just want to bring that to your attention. So V Conlon here is saying that with my last student, we both spent time writing strengths and improvements after each of the lessons she taught, and then shared what we both had suggested. The student found this very valuable. That is great. Those moments when you're aligned in your thinking, I think, can be sort of really reassuring for the student teachers. And I suppose reflecting on that myself, if their strengths and areas for improvement don't align with yours as the mentor, then maybe it's because the student teacher has sort of misunderstood something, they haven't got a full enough understanding, and you can make an intervention. That's a really great strategy. Thank you very much for sharing that. So it's about sort of building all of those teacher education approaches that are different to our pedagogical approaches that we use with young people, not too dissimilar, but they are distinctive because we're working with adult learners and we're working with people who are trying to become teachers. So, you know, tailoring our approaches to that is really important. So another tool for your arsenal here is clinical reasoning. So I'm going to spend a bit of time unpicking clinical reasoning for you now. And if any questions or observations come up as we're going through, do feel free to pop them in the chat. So clinical reasoning is an approach to feedback, but it's also an approach to getting the students to reflect on the teaching that they've just done or their practice more broadly. Before we look at the approach, I thought you might benefit from hearing why we think that we need to improve our approach. And when I say we, I don't just mean mentors, I mean us as university tutors and senior mentors too. So what do we know about teaching? We know that teaching is a really complicated, and I put ACT in air quotation marks there because it's not just about the performative aspect of what we do in the classroom that makes it complicated. It's complicated because it actually rests upon a lot of knowledge that's being drawn upon in the moment by you as teachers, as practicing teachers, that guides your minute-to-minute decisions in the classroom. And the difficulty for the student teacher is that they can't access it because it's happening in your mind. So if you decide in the middle of a lesson to change something up, to adapt, to move in a different direction, to change the sequencing of what you've planned because of something you picked up on from the learners, the student won't necessarily realize that because we don't just give a play-by-play of everything that's going through our mind as it's happening. So we've got this problem that experienced teachers' knowledge in use, so that tacit knowledge, is really difficult for the student teachers to access. Expertise revealed in practice can sometimes be difficult to articulate because we haven't always got the time to give them that play-by-play. And then if we look to literature, teachers' expertise essentially depends on this process that I just described that's happening in the moment. It's a process of selection, selecting things that have happened in the middle of the lesson to think about, to decide what to do with, interpreting what we've selected, and then making a judgment about what to do next. So it might be that you've done some scanning of the pupils' work whilst they're working independently. You make a selection of what it is that you need to work on with the learners. Maybe there's some common mistakes, common misconceptions. We interpret that and then we make a judgment in the moment to make an intervention. And that is incredibly complex, and it is sort of like the foundations of our expertise. What we also know from literature is that for student teachers, the desire to secure their identity as a teacher and to be accepted as a teacher by pupils and by you as their mentor could lead the trainees into just imitating and mimicking what they're seeing you do, because they want to be a professional and seen to be a professional really quickly, but they're a learner, so they might not necessarily know why they're doing what they're doing. So if they are simply imitating you, they might not be able to do what you do, which is to genuinely develop this adaptive expertise that you will be doing very, very well. So we've got this problem, and this is why we need a new approach to get the students to access your knowledge in use, but to also bring their knowledge in use to the fore. So this is where clinical reasoning comes in. So Clinical reasoning is called that because it's commonly used not only in clinical practice models of teacher education like we've got, but it's also linked to other practitioners who are training to be to work in the medical profession. So those who are working in the medical profession, they have to analyze, they have to be intuitive, they have to make professional judgments, sometimes in the moment. So they go through this process of reasoning, and we need to model this for student teachers because it won't necessarily come naturally to them. So we've got a quote here from Krevalt and Turnage, who wrote a really accessible paper on this that we'll share after the session. And it says clinical reasoning is the analytical and intuitive cognitive processes that professionals like you use to arrive at a best judged ethical response in a specific practice-based context, which is a really, really fancy way of describing what we do. Although I'm quite glad that it's fancy because I think it really shows how complex it is that, you know, the thing that we do when we're teaching, that cognitive process that we go through. So what does it involve? I'm going to try and make it as accessible as possible here. And I'm going to give you some conversation prompts in a minute that you might use with your student teachers to encourage them to engage in clinical reasoning. So the first element is that it needs to be respectful and reciprocal dialogue, okay? And it's characterized by listening, and that's on the part of you, the mentor, and the student teacher. It needs to be open dialogue, so the student needs to be able to sort of reveal what they do and don't know. And I suppose you, the mentor, also need to be open about things that you're still trying to develop and work on as well. So you need to be open with one another in order for it to have that reciprocal learning benefit. But, and this is where you come in, it also requires skillful prompting. So you need to ask the right questions for clinical reasoning to happen. Number two, it relies on the iterative use, so the kind of cyclical use of data and evidence. And it refers to the ways in which mentors and student teachers draw on classroom data and theory to support their evaluations and well-reasoned designs for the next steps in teaching. So what that means is that you, the mentor, and the student teacher may be having taught a lesson together or having observed the student teacher teach. You need to work together to think about what did you see the learners, how were they responding, and what kind of classroom data are we drawing upon to make judgments about how well that went. What was going on in their books if it's not a practical subject? What were we hearing from their responses? What were they struggling with? So that's that classroom data there. Theory, what do we know about theory, about assessment for learning, let's say, that might support us in evaluating whether that lesson went well, whether the strategies used were impactful, and then to decide what do we do next? Okay, so it's about that use of data and evidence that mentors and student teachers work through to evaluate whether what happened in the classroom worked or didn't work and what the next steps and consequences are. The third bit is articulating reasoning. Now, it's important to get the student teacher to articulate their reasoning for something. So let's say they've just taught a lesson and they say to you, I really don't think that group work exercise worked. I'm never going to do it again because the learners aren't ready for it. They can't cope with it. So, unless you ask them, they're not gonna articulate that. And unless you ask them why do you think that? How could we test it? How do we know? Then it's not necessarily going to make that learning on the part of the student teacher visible. So we've got to get them to articulate their reasoning so it makes their understanding visible. But also when you articulate your reasoning to them, it makes your tacit knowledge accessible to the student teacher. So this is where it gives the reciprocal benefits. And then finally, in clinical reasoning, there's a final stage. It's all about probing their personal assumptions and theories about learning. So probing their personal assumptions and theories is central to supporting a more critical orientation towards improving teaching. It interrupts unquestioning acceptance and imitation of existing beliefs and practices. So let's go back to my example a moment ago about group work. If we don't probe the assumption on the part of the student teacher, which is that I'm never going to do group work ever again, because the pupils can't cope with it. So they're assuming that the pupils can't cope with it, and they're assuming that it won't work. Unless you, the mentor, sort of try to interrupt that deficit perspective on behalf of the student teacher, then you're not necessarily going to cause them to question their existing beliefs and to change their practice. They might carry on imitating things or sticking with their sort of preconceived ideas. Okay, so how do we do this then? I've got 2 slides of conversation prompts here for you to consider. So let's go back to the example I gave a moment ago about group work. Let's say the student teacher has taught a lesson and they have made that comment about group work. In order to focus their attention on key aspects of their practice and to really start to dig into it more deeply, you might ask them, well, what questions does this raise? If you think that the group work wasn't successful, what questions does this raise? Was it just that the group work wasn't carefully planned for? Was it that the pupils weren't ready to engage in group work? And then when they've started to sort of unpick that, you might move them on to start thinking, well, what intervention is likely to have the greatest impact? If we were going to make an intervention to make group work better, what intervention could we use that's going to have the greatest impact? What has been done with regard to group work already, and how can progress be made from here? So questions that focus their attention on that particular aspect of practice that they're finding difficult. And then we've got questions that prompt student teachers to seek and use evidence. Now, this is really important. So if they have said that didn't work, I'm never using it again, you might ask them, well, what evidence supports this? Or how do we know? How can we check? And what literature could we seek to advance our thinking? So there, the mentor is sort of encouraging them to draw upon the data, the classroom data, what they saw, the behaviours of the learners. And if it transpires that when you ask them, well, how do we know? The student teacher might not be able to say. So you know that there's a problem there with the student teacher's judgments of what's going on when they're teaching a lesson. And then encouraging them to look to literature to help advance. And note that it says our thinking, that you're sort of positioning yourself as a co-inquirer with your student teacher. And then we've got another bank of questions, firstly associated with checking and developing their understanding. Now, there's some subtle differences here in the approach that you might take when you're encouraging clinical reasoning to approaches that you might normally take with a student teacher. Now, some feedback that we often get from mentors when we come in as university tutors is, I've given them this feedback again and again, and they're just not getting it. They're not able to improve. I've told them this, I've told them this. And it might be in the blue book that they're getting the same feedback again and again and again. But unless we ask the right questions to check their understanding, it might be that they're not getting it right because they don't know how, they don't understand, or they're just imitating what they're seeing you do without the understanding underpinning it. So by asking things like, I noticed that you did this this time when, you know, up until now I've been telling you to do it this way, but I noticed you didn't do it the way I told you this time. And this happened. Am I right about that? So it's sort of an open-handed invitation for them to reflect on why they didn't do what you told them. And you might say, it puzzled me when you did this, or when that happened in the lesson, or when you diverted from the plan, maybe. Tell me why you did that. In what other ways could this be approached? So it's sort of opportunity to check their understanding, and it's putting it back on them to reflect on what happened. It doesn't have to all come from you to tell them this worked, this didn't work, this worked, this didn't work. So it's a lot more sort of reciprocal and a lot more sort of encouraging them to reflect themselves. And then the final bank is about challenging those ideas and assumptions that they might have made about learners or about their practice. So asking things like, well, what would happen if we did this? What is the assumption that you've made about group work or about the learners not being able to engage in group work? How might you investigate or test that assumption? Explain why you say that group work doesn't work with this class. So really encouraging them to probe their own personal perspective. And that last one, really interesting in addressing that sort of deficit perspective that a student teacher might have. What were or might be any unintended consequences of that action? So if they've said, I'm not going to use group work ever again. If you ask, well, what might be the unintended consequences of that action? What could be the upshot of you never doing group work with them again in the future? And that could cause them to sort of address that deficit perspective. Okay, so we've got clear prompts that are going to potentially put it back onto the student to reflect on their practice. And hopefully this approach, if you use it sort of wisely with your student teacher, it might not work in the early stages with a student teacher who's a novice. They might need that more direct approach to feedback from you, more mentor-led. But when they're ready, moving them forward to this more student-led approach to analysing their practice and reflecting on it, it might have benefits for them, but also reciprocal benefits for you. So when might we use these conversation prompts when they're with you? Well, you might use them when scrutinising the student teacher's lesson plan. So there's an opportunity there to look at something they've planned to happen, and maybe you'll ask, well, what might be the unintended consequences of doing that in the lesson, encouraging them to think about it more deeply. Maybe when you're team planning with them, so when they're telling you what they intend to do, and maybe it's not sort of coinciding with what you've intended for that lesson, you can use some of those conversation prompts there to get them thinking more deeply. The most common place that we think this might be useful for you to use is after a formal or informal lesson observation. So going through that process of those conversation prompts when you've observed them. But to flip it the other way, maybe encouraging the student teacher to use those questions and ask them of you after they have observed you teaching. It could be quite powerful in, as I said earlier on, bringing your knowledge and use, your tacit knowledge to the fore for the student teacher. And then finally, it might be that they've done something outside of the lesson that you want them to dig into a bit more deeply. So maybe they've done some research and inquiry and you want to know, well, what are the consequences for this, for your practice? How can we test if what you've learned when you were reading up on X strategy, how can we test if that's going to have impact and efficacy in our classroom? So hopefully that's given you sort of an insight into something new, a new and different approach to organising feedback and reflection with your student teacher. And we have got a really quick crib sheet that we'll share after the session that you might want to use as an aid memoir when you're trialling this. And we really encourage you to trial this in your own practice. Okay, so I'm going to encourage some audience participation now, and we're going to come into the last section of this professional learning. And I want us to start to think about student teachers as learners, the beginning teachers, and their different learning needs at different points in the programme. So firstly, maybe you could put some reflections in the chat. How do the learning needs and behaviours of student teachers change and compare? And we'll start with the first bullet point at the start of their first placement compared to the end of their second placement. If you could pop any thoughts in the chat, how do the learning needs and behaviours of your student teachers, thinking about student teachers you worked with in the past, how do they compare and change at the start of their first placement compared with the end of their second placement? I'm just going to give you some time to think about that and add some thoughts to the chat. Okay, So at the start, they might be more prepared to take a leading role in the children's. Oh, I see. So later on, they might be more prepared to take a leading role in the children's learning. Really nice point there. Much more independent at the end, more willing to have a go and think of their own ideas. Absolutely. So we wouldn't necessarily, therefore, encourage a student teacher at the start of CP1 to plan a medium-term scheme of work or a sequence of lessons or even an individual lesson on their own, because they haven't got that experience, they haven't got the confidence and their own ideas. I see. Yeah, they're really ready to embark on that NQT year. They spend more time focusing on behaviour management at the start. Now, we're seeing this come through in the in some research that we've been doing, actually, that they do spend more time focusing on behaviour management at the start, but more focused on pedagogy by the end. Yeah, it's a really good point. And actually, that does have, and we refer you to some of the questions we've got at the bottom of that slide, are how do or should your mentoring approaches change, therefore, when they're really focused on behaviour management as opposed to when they're really focused on behaviour? Are you going to need to adopt a much more sort of prescriptive approach at the beginning and encourage a much more reflective approach towards the end? So let's get some comments on a different point of transition now. So how do the learning needs and behaviours of student teachers change and compare at the start of CP2, so when they're starting their second placement, compared to the end of CP1, which is the end of their first placement? And for the PGCE students, that is about to happen now. So they've just finished their first placement. Some of them might have a lot of the standards graded as capable. They're about to start a brand new placement. It's the start of CP2 for them next week. How are their learning needs and behaviours going to change? The end of CP1 compared to the start of their second placement, CP2. Just give you a moment to think about that and put any thoughts in the chat. Yeah, it's a good one to get us started there, Kerry. I certainly was with my PGCE student teachers today, and the anxiety around starting somewhere new is,
Yeah.
Go on, are you going to come in? Go for it.
No, thinking exactly the same. Can you hear me, Emma?
I
Sorry.
can.
I'm in
I
quite
can.
an echoey room, but exactly that. Can't underestimate the stress levels are really high. Entering CP2 for our PGC, I imagine primary and secondary, the not knowing, they were very content. They'd sort of they'd established themselves, they had a relatedness with their classes and their colleagues, and not having that is causing them to be quite anxious.
Yeah, really good point. And when we know and understand that they're coming in with that anxiety, we can meet them where they are. Great point in the chat here. This can be a really tricky time. They do find out that what worked in one school, and that can be an absolute horrifying moment for a student teacher when they realise that the strategy that was really working well for them in their first placement isn't working in the same way with the learners they've got in front of them in their second placement. And there's even more reason there to encourage clinical reasoning approach, to get them to think about why it didn't work that time around. What are the consequences? What do we need to think about in this context that might have been different to the previous context? If we think about the BA colleagues in the room as well, you've got student teachers coming to you for clinical practice 1, but they've done an observational placement in year 1 of the programme. So at that point, they might have observed a lot and thought, I can do this. I think I can have a go at this. I think I'll be all right. But then when they come to start teaching, and bearing in mind it's been quite a while since that observational placement, similar to what the comment is in the chat, they might try something out that they saw being done in their observational placement, and it goes down like a lead balloon. So the point here is that we really need to consider the learning needs and behaviours of the teacher that we've got in front of us, get to know what's come before, the experiences they've had, maybe the stumbling blocks that they found, maybe the strengths that they're anticipating are going to be replicated in their new placement, so that we can catch them when they fall and we can support them when those difficult situations come up. We can support them by getting them to unpick them, maybe by using clinical reasoning. Thanks for the engagement in the chat there. Appreciate that. Okay, so what are our recommendations? We're coming towards the end of this session now. So what can you do? What other approaches can you make? Well, the first thing you're going to want to do, and I'm sure you will all do this as mentors, is to have that initial discussion about your student teacher's prior experience and existing beliefs about teaching and learning, which sounds quite heavy, but having that initial conversation. What experiences did you have in the first placement? What was going well? What were the common themes of feedback you were getting from your mentor? What did you observe when you were on your observational placement? What do you think really good teaching and learning looks like? Taking the time to really bring those preconceptions that in some ways might be really useful for them and for you to the fore, but it might also give you a sense of their orientations to learning from experience. And I'm going to talk about that now last as we come into this last section of the professional learning. So we want you to consider your student teacher's orientations to learning, to the different dimensions of learning from experience. So I'm going to show you an image now that comes from a book called Beginning Teachers Learning that we'll share with you after the session. And we've got a podcast on it as well. So this comes from a lot of research that took place following student teachers from their PGCE or their initial teacher education on a BA programme all the way through to their second year of teaching. And what they found was that there are different dimensions to learning from experience. And if I refer you to the fourth row, response to feedback, this is probably the most accessible one for us to start with. So this is the trainee's disposition towards receiving feedback and the value they attribute to it. So whether they think it's valuable to them and what they do with it as a response to that. So if I just broaden it out so you can see how they might be orientated differently towards responding to feedback, you might have a student teacher that's got a tendency to be completely flawed, completely disabled by critical feedback. That might manifest itself through sort of emotional outbursts. It might be that they become really introverted. And if you know that you've got a student teacher that's orientated in that way, you will take a different approach to giving feedback, hopefully, than you would with a student who is orientated towards effective use of feedback to further their learning. And in between that sort of either opposite end of those orientations are maybe some strategies that you use that try to tip them into that much more positive approach to using their feedback effectively. So it might be that if they're disabled by it, you say, right, I want you to go away and read my feedback first. I want you to reflect on it. Maybe the strategy that was recommended in the chat earlier on, which I think is excellent, you come up with your 3 strengths and 3 areas for development. I'm going to come up with mine. We're going to go away and just let that sit for a little bit and get over what just happened. Come back together and reflect on it when when you're feeling ready to do that. So giving that time and space to calm down, to have space, might be really useful. Equally, if you've got someone that's really effective of using feedback to further their learning, then you might need to push them even more. And maybe clinical reasoning is the way that you get them to do that, right? How do you know? How can you test that? Go away and do some reading that chimes with the feedback that you've been given and that might cause you to move forward. So we take any one of these dimensions and think about them in a relation to a student teacher that we've worked with in the past, it can be quite illuminating as to the way that we were working with them and how we maybe enabled them to shift in their orientation, and maybe things that we didn't that we didn't do, or missed opportunities that could have tipped the balance. So let's talk about one other one before we start to bring this to a close. And this is the attitude to the context. This is a really interesting one. So this is the attitude to the positions in which trainees find themselves and the approaches that they take to the school context. So if they regard or are orientated to regard the context as constraining, so and I come back to this idea of a deficit perspective, they might go, oh, I'm going to this school next. I know that that's in an area of high socioeconomic disadvantage. They're not going to be able to do this. They won't be able to do that, a real sort of deficit perspective. And I'm not saying that, I don't want to be stereotypical here, but you might have students that see the context as constraining, and it might be more benign than that. It might be, well, I can't do that at the moment because I haven't seen my mentor doing it. So if I don't see my mentor doing it, then the context is constraining. I can't do it, or I won't be encouraged to do it. Versus acceptance of the context and see how they can capitalize on it. So this is everything I know about this school, and this is what I'm going to do. These are opportunities for me to capitalize on it. And I kind of refer back to that student teacher that was thinking quite negatively about group work. They might go, these kids can't do group work. They can't cope with it. They can't even speak to each other. If you've got a student like that, they might never ever try it ever again. It could limit the opportunities for the learners, limit the progress for the teacher. If they accept it and see it as an opportunity, and they work with you as the mentor, and they're asking the right questions, or how can I make this work? What are the learners going to need? What am I going to do about it? Then potentially they're going to learn better, and their young people are going to have better learning outcomes as a result. So what we encourage you to do is to kind of go back to this table in the future. Consider the student teacher you've got in front of you. Think about how they're orientated and start to intervene accordingly. And, we're not talking about you sort of doing anything grand here, but maybe thinking about the way you're delivering feedback, or the way you're asking them to spend their research and inquiry time, the way you're operating with them with regard to team teaching, etc. So there are consequences, and hopefully thinking about these things might be useful. And then the last recommendation we've got for you is to try those clinical reasoning prompts to make implicit aspects of your practice explicit to your student teachers. So try not to make any assumptions, that they will understand from what they're seeing you do what's going on in your head and why you're making those decisions. And only through that professional dialogue is that going to come to the fore. So we're going to draw this to a close now. We hope you found that interesting, and it's given you some food for thought about your own practice as mentors and teacher educators more broadly. In the short term, you're going to be sort of inducting your new student teacher into your department. So those early conversations with them are going to be really important to understand their preconceptions and what's come before. Make sure you have access to their PLP. Really get to know them as a learner and plan accordingly. And in the medium term, we'd love it if you could trial some of those approaches. We will send out that quick aid memoir for clinical reasoning to help support your professional dialogue. And remember not to skip that all-important meeting in the progress review, and have that professional dialogue with your student teacher at those key assessment points on the programme. So just a final reminder of what you've got coming up in future. We'd really love it if you could come along to those future sessions if they can help you. We're going to stop the recording there, but do feel free, if you've got any questions, to pop them in the chat or to hang about to speak to us afterwards. And we thank you ever so much